affected directly or indirectly. Yeah, and just as just a couple of housekeeping things, we've asked everyone to keep their videos off for the initial part because we'll be recording that. Will you be fine with us recording this, Chris?
Absolutely, that's fine.
Yeah. And then, so how this will go, Chris, is I have a few questions about EL education and about expeditions in general. So maybe they'll take about half an hour, 40 minutes. And then the teachers have we've sent your bio and your work on the salmon expedition that you shared with us yesterday. We've shared it with the team. So they have a few questions. So we'll take it up after that. And then at the very end, everyone will switch on their videos. So you'll get a chance to see them. Is that fine? The reason we're doing it is so the recordings would be better and we could share it with a wider community.
Absolutely. I'm just honored and humbled that you were interested in having a conversation with me today. I hope I have something meaningful to share, and I'm sure I'll learn something from you all as well. So I'm happy to be connected with your school.
And yeah, it's our pleasure. I've known you at least for a couple of years now. I met Amy at one of the conferences at ASP, and through her I got in touch with you, and you've been a well-wisher of the school ever since. Of course, you are on our advisory board. You feel very deeply about EL education. You've been associated with them in some capacity right since their inception, and you're really passionate about taking the EL education or that model of learning to other schools in Asia. So it's our privilege to have you here.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so let me, and everyone else, you could just keep your audio and video off for some time, and then I'll kind of rope you in one by one. Let me just spin your video so I can see you, Chris. Okay, all right, we can get started. The first question, and this is just a regular conversation, but I just have some questions at least as conversation starters. The first question that I have here is, EL education resonates with you on a personal level. You've written in your bio, you've spoken about it. So what is it about EL education that resonates with you, and why do you feel so deeply about it, and why do you feel that many more schools should get benefit of EL education?
Oh, okay. So there's a number of facets to that. So feel free to redirect me to make sure that I stay to the clear thread. I think fundamentally, sort of there's layers to this. So why I'm so passionate about EL education is as a model for reforming schools. I think that they have been very effective at distilling some of the best practices and models and instructional practice that have the greatest impact in transforming schools, community, and the experience of students. So there are many good models out there. And so I've worked around Cambridge and IB, Montessori, Reggio Emilia, Waldorf, project-based learning, and I'm sure none of these, the sort of reform or school models are going to be foreign to most of the people participating today. There's all things you've heard of. So it's not always that EL is better or doing something different. What I think they did really effectively is they distilled the insights into teaching and learning from many different models, including their own original insights, into a very cohesive, implementable, and accessible model that's highly replicable. So there's sort of just a pragmatic reason why I'm a really big fan of it. I don't want to criticize anything, per se in the IB, but even now as I end up working around IB a lot. When people are really passionate about ideas and you have committees together and they're sort of really trying to push their thinking, sometimes that can lead to a complexity and an obscurity where you can get too far removed from the initial insight or impetus for what you're doing. And when I look at EL, they've been able to stay very, very close to that. So that's one reason I really think, when I propose this idea of that staying connected as a group of schools in Asia trying to promote this model, well, why? Cambridge is already here, IB is here, Ratio is here. It's because I think it is so effective, it is so replicable. A lot of its practices can have an impact on the national curriculums of the various countries. So I hope, and I've actually think we're even beginning to see that. I've stayed in contact with people who've told me CBSE is engaging in some reforms. And the little bit I've heard of it, it sounds like moving in that direction. So I think the international schools that are implementing things like EL, because it's so replicable, it's accessible, you can pick a core practice or you can pick an element of it to focus on. We really have the potential to have an impact on the larger conversation about education in our various contexts and nationalities. One, just as a caveat, which I think is important for your own community moving forward, is why EL was able to obtain this is, I got to watch EL evolve a little bit, and I think it's still evolving, is that it wasn't a think tank that sat behind closed doors and mapped out a school model and said, here it is. I mean, I'm sure your community knows some of the history about Outward Bound and the Harvard School of Education, and in the US context, the US government looking for break the mold school designs. And I could talk more about it if people are interested in that history. But to a certain extent, when EL first was awarded this relationship with the government to pilot the model, they said, oh shoot, now we got to figure out how it really works inside schools. And so what they did was create a way for the collective learning of all the teachers and administrators and everybody that was trying to do this work could communicate, collaborate, and share their struggles and their successes through the national conference every year, which I've been fortunate enough to attend probably 5 or 6 by now, as well as lots of other meetings. So the family of schools. So with the core practices and the models, they really evolved over time. And again, they didn't come from Greg Farrell or Scott Hartle or even Stephen Levy alone. I really look at them as, I'll use this word a lot, but the distillation of learning and experience of thousands of educators and hundreds of schools that were all very aligned on trying to do similar work. And again, that's why I think it's such a powerful model and why it is very pragmatic and replicable and accessible and can be taken in its entirety, or segments of it can be focused on, because it doesn't come from professors at Harvard. They were involved, they were informed, but it really comes from teachers like every single teacher on this call today, trying to make it work in their classroom. And when they found something powerful and effective and they found something that worked, they shared it in dialogue, in a conversation with teachers at other schools. And eventually bubbling to the top came a set of really powerful best practices or areas to really pay attention to in terms of having a positive effect. So there's a pragmatic reason, but I also want to speak a little bit to the heart, which is another reason I'm very personally passionate about it. Is when we talk about education reform, we often use words like progressive, innovative, new, revolutionary. I actually, sometimes it's a little provocative, but I like to say to people that EL is actually extremely conservative because it's going back, really. It's not so much going forward. It's found a way by going forward to go back to the way human beings have learned to survive, have developed their character, have learned to do high quality work, have mastered the skills and knowledge necessary to be successful in their communities for most of human history. And I'm certainly not the expert on it, but even in the little bit I've studied education, the history of education in India, right? It is not new or revolutionary in Indian context at all to know that the cultivation of character, the exploration of the self, the struggling with big questions of morality and having a positive impact and is separate from the role of the teacher and education, right? And the Gurdwaras or the Guruncle system, you know, the various blurring almost between religious centers and education throughout history. So that notion, right? EL is putting character back at the center of education, but that's not really new. For a long time, that's been done. Same thing with this idea of having young people engage in essentially authentic, analogous work to what the adults do in their community, right? The concept of an apprenticeship. So when we take kids on learning expeditions and we bring in experts and we have them publish a book, or we have them work as ecologists and design a frog pond for restoring a habitat, right? So we often think about that as, oh, we're having children engage in real work like adults do outside of the school. But if you think about it, that's the way young human beings have learned to survive for thousands and thousands of years. First they played like the hunter-gatherers or the farmers or the tradespeople or whatever context they were in. First it was play, then it was apprenticeship. It got more and more realistic until eventually they acquired the skills and they were able to take on some kind of economic role within their society and their community. So I think this is a pretty profound element of this, in that what EL is doing is really, you know, speaking to something very fundamental about our communities and the way that we as human beings were meant to learn, to participate in our community. And they found a way to take that and blend it with the modern construct of a school. Because if we think about it, this modern idea of sending kids all the same age to a building with a single adult to learn is a very, very young construct, right? In many places of the world, it's, you know, 100, for the majority of the population, it's about 100 years old, where human beings have been around a lot longer than that. So we're kind of, the standard high stakes exam school is like a mass experiment in human psychology and condition that's very, very recent, and I would argue is not reflective of our of nature and learning. So that's another element beyond the pragmatics, is I really believe fundamentally the totality of the core practices speak to how we were meant to learn and how we were meant to make community with our young people. I know it's a long answer, but the last I have to get to my last point is I don't think it's that radical a statement to say our collective survival as a species on our planet is in question in a way that it has never been in the modern era, right? Whether we want to look at social pressures, environmental changes, the coronavirus is an incredible lesson in our concept of nations and borders and class are irrelevant when we face something as much of a threat to our safety as the coronavirus. So even the articles I'm reading now, I just read there are 9 new billionaires have been created due to the income off of vaccines and coronavirus, which in fact, the author of the article pointed out, their profit beyond $1 million would have been enough to both produce and vaccinate every single person in India. But yet we still have a system that does that, allows, I'm not saying they're bad people, I don't know them, but it's an interesting thing to think about how we have 9 new billionaires on the back of unprecedented suffering. So the idea of EL education having the courage to make the world a better place as the North Star, if you will, of what the totality of the educational program is doing, I think it's not just a feel-good moment. It's not just so we can say, oh, this is nice, or we want kids to play itself. Even if your goal is to be rich, if you don't have healthy, stable people and environment and nations, you know, even your business models are going to be under threat. Whatever lens you look for, survival is now. So the collective necessity of humanity to start making whatever piece of work you have in this life, whether you're a classroom teacher, you own a corporation, you're a doctor, you make cars, you've got to think about how your work can also make the world a better place if we're going to collectively survive as a crew on this planet. And so personally, I'm really feel strongly that that is a not tangential, but the idea that you can have livelihood, you can have successful career, you can have mastery of what you want to do, but you have an obligation to have your work make the world a better place is a really powerful part of what EL is doing.
Yeah, that's one of the best expositions of EL I've ever heard. No, really, I mean it. And so, yes, are a brilliant team, and they've joined us because they feel strongly about a lot of things that you said, and then they also feel that the progressive education or the expectations or this whole bent of education has solution to some of the problems that we spoke about. But I think
Sorry, I missed that. Could you say it again, please?
Siri. But I guess what will help is if we could dive deep into how an expedition's done. And we've read about the salmon expedition, and it's extraordinary. It has. I have questions on so many aspects of it. Like I've kind of broken it down. The first thing that you from your article where you mentioned that I'm quoting you, the right topic eliminates half the struggle. And then there is another quote from the same article where you say students respond to the fact that it is their ability. Students respond to the fact that it is their ability to learn new skills and knowledge that will keep these fragile creatures alive and ensure that the salmon will remain healthy and grow until they can be released. So yeah, if you could just talk about how important it is to select the right topic, and how important it is to bring, like you talk about bringing live salmon eggs into the classroom and seeing them grow, and how critical it is for students to know their stuff, because if they don't know the stuff, then probably the eggs will die or they'll not grow on to become full adults. So yeah, just talk to us about that.
Okay, so there's a number of things going on there. I think I'll start with, so one of my theories about what's happening in a learning expedition like this, or in education in general, is reflecting on the role of emotions in learning and memory. So it's probably all of us can think of an experience in our own life, or certainly know about, where someone's had a really dramatic experience. Let's say the birth of a child, or a car accident, bad car accident, or some other, or a national event, you know, where even today, like, we can remember every minute and every detail so clearly, we can recall it. We can put ourselves right back there. And often, if there were other people involved, sometimes strangers, or people we knew, but there's also a strong emotional bond with the other people who shared this common experience where there was heightened emotions. Now, I'm not saying that we replicate a car accident feeling with our students, obviously, but what I think this simple point has to remind us is that when emotions are awoken, right? When sincere, real emotions are awoken, memory, investment, engagement, and connection with other human beings is increased. I think this is just written into our neurology. And we also know that conventional school can often deaden emotions, right? They can really just experience sitting in rows, listening to someone lecture. Often one of the biggest emotions not in our EL schools, but in conventional school, that we awaken is fear, right? So fear of not getting top marks, fear of humiliation, if you fail the exam, fear of disappointing your parents. So, one of my talking points I often say is, when we look at motivation in the classroom, too often our message is learn or I'll hurt you, right? And in some schools it used to be physically hurt, but often that hurt was emotional, it was shame. I'll belittle you, I'll give you a low rank, you'll get low marks, your parents aren't going to love you, you're not going to get a good job, right? So fear and shame, I would say, are not the best motivators. So anyway, back to emotion. But I like to bring this into learning expeditions, and we can't always do it to the same degree, but think about how do we awaken the emotions of the child in a positive way through the learning expedition? And that can be as simply as caring, right? So what you described is, I do believe that particular learning expedition, many of these students in that particular context were somewhat numb to relationships with animals in the natural environment. That was an urban environment, and they hadn't really been an opportunity. So what you described there is the phrase I use is giving them a reason to care, right? So a lot of this comes back to, if you can, we often talk about the launch of a learning expedition or learning experience, or the hook is another term people use. My friend Stephen Levy, who is probably a name you've heard, was one of the first school designers of EL. We both always had a little problem with the hook, because if you play out the metaphor, right, you put bait on the hook, you trick the fish, you think, oh, this is going to be something good. The next thing, they've got a hook in their mouth and you're reeling them in, getting them to do what you want to do. So I don't want to overthink it, but we always both said, well, is there a better analogy? And so the one I use is the call, or I even use the term the call to adventure. Is my favorite. And I don't want to get too far afield, but if any of you are a fan of mythology or comparative mythology, literature, or movies, you may have encountered an author and thinker by the name of Joseph Campbell. If you don't know them, someone should, yes, Hero's Journey, I saw it pop up in there. Oh, good, in the chat. I should be following the chat. I don't have it open, but absolutely, I'm referring to the Hero's Journey. And so in the Hero's Journey, for those of you who know it, and if you don't, just Google it, you'll get a graphic instantly. Joseph Campbell mapped out these fundamental elements that he found in all the hero myths from around the world. And the one I'm going to is the call to adventure. And in fact, I've asked our staff to use that, and we put that on our planning templates for learning expedition. And so I do think it's not always just one moment, it may be sustained. That's so the compelling topic, or getting the right topic, to me is related to the launch and the call to adventure. So we can't always do it. You can't always get all students. Don't beat yourself up. But if you can replicate a call to adventure, right? That's the idea of the hero's journey. The hero's having a fairly normal, typical day. Their life's going on, and suddenly it's a burning bush. There's a lightning bolt. They find a sword in the stone. God comes down and speaks to them, right? Something happens, and suddenly they're off on this journey. But they're very emotionally invested in the journey, the hero, because they have some great work to do. Something of consequence. And I think this is, again, I'm a little abstract here, but I think this is a great way to frame trying to find the compelling topic and how we launch it. And so getting, which for me is, I will confess, I am encouraged theatrics here. So often I will ask teachers to try to think about a way that the call cannot come from even them in the classroom. So that the idea that we've even staged this, where we would have outside experts come in and sort of ask if they can speak to our students. The teachers say, oh, no, we're busy. We have lessons to do. And they say, please, we really want to talk to your students. Okay. They describe their work, the students get riled up, and they say, teacher, can we do that? And the teacher says, absolutely not. We have a syllabus to cover, we have stuff to do. Students saying, please come on, and the teacher finally relents and say, okay, maybe we can spend some time on this. I hope this doesn't feel disingenuous, but the teachers have actually been planning this for months and have done all the research. But because I think maybe it's a little deceptive, but it's done with care, we've got the kids, their emotions are awoken. And so this is a replicable phenomenon. So you might be saying, salmon are a cold water species native to the North continent. What does this have to do with Mumbai in your context? A project we did, I don't know if I've had a chance to talk to you, but the last project I did before leaving Gurgaon, Delhi NCR, that I'm really proud of, and I shouldn't share a copy with your community, was it's a long story, and I can go into it. It's based on the work, it was done in partnership with the People's Archive of Rural India, PARI. Some of you may know their work. If you don't, absolutely, when you get out of the session, look at their website. They do absolutely phenomenal work. Basically, they're trying to document the untold stories of marginalized, rural, or disenfranchised groups throughout India. There's a great story about their founder, but we got connected with them. But the students went out into their own community and they interviewed and had deep conversations with people that they would normally never interact with from every element of society. So this included, a very successful corporate lawyer for a wireless mobile company, to an out-of-work maid from Nepal, to a traditional biscuit maker who still cooked over wood fire, a cobbler sitting at the side of the road, a small business owner, every type of community. And the kind of thing that happened there, so first they were called by, like Pari does, they were called by this idea of there are invisible stories, powerful stories in your community that are not being documented. And nobody's doing this work. One of the things Pari points out is, I think in India is, about 60% of the population live in a rural context, but they make up less than 1% of all national media stories. So one of the missions of Pari is that these people are becoming invisible. Their lives, their struggles, their successes, whatever, they just don't get reported on. And urban populations particularly are becoming blind one way or the other to what's happening to many of the other people in India. So the first call was this idea of nobody's done this work in Gurgaon. Nobody knows who's here. It's full of migrants. It's full of people, all different walks of life. Students, we don't have time. Can you do this work? So they were very worked up. The second call sort of came, I'll hone in on one moment where this was seventh graders, two young ladies were interviewing a Nepalese woman. She was a maid. She'd worked in domestics since she was 8 years old in Delhi. And she'd never been to formal school. And they're interviewing her about her life. And one of the things she talked about was the challenges she felt as a woman in the particular place she lived in Gurgaon as being very unsafe, and particularly being Nepalese. She felt she really looked different, and everybody knew that she wasn't from Haryana and she wasn't local. And then for her woman's safety, she felt really nervous, and she was frustrated on that. And she said, I really want to do something about that. And even here, for the safety, I as a young mother shouldn't worry for my safety just because I'm a woman. So after the interview, when the two students came out, they were so wide-eyed, and they turned to each other and said, we had no idea that a maid could think those things, that somebody who never went to school would be talking about feminism and women's safety and the status of girls and women in society. This is what we talk about with our moms and our sisters and our teachers at school. How is this possible that she's thinking and struggling with the exact same things? So what happened in that moment was we had them. Their next move was, we have to tell this story. We have to tell other people, because we can never look at a woman like this who dresses like her or lives in a place like she does the same way again. And we want to make sure that people know that it doesn't matter what you do for work, or maybe your level of education, that you still can be just as deep a thinker, and the same issues like women's safety will affect you as well. So what I'm getting at this is sometimes the call is at the start, but in this case, the even deeper call happened here. So these students, now we're getting into, they had to do research, they had to do writing, we had a photography component, they even had to do, there was math and science, all these other elements were mapped to it that I could go into. But while I'm focusing on this part, this is the emotional part. Something had been awoken in them. They were now called to do this work because it had relevance, it had meaning, and they saw their opportunity to tell somebody whose story was not being told and have a positive impact. So the compelling topic, this idea of finding a way to replicate this. And again, what I'm trying to do here, I know this kind of may have felt like it got a feel, but what I'm trying to say, it's not about salmon or living things, nor is it about the issues facing women from Nepal working in Gurgaon. To me, the common thread is the students were called to do the work by, you can fill in all the various variables that went into that. But I think in choosing the compelling topic and choosing the elements that can replicate, read the hero's journey for inspiration, but can replicate that experience for your students where they really feel called to do something of consequence. Their emotions are awoken, and you've got them to care about the impact of what they're learning and doing.
That's really good. That's brilliant. And this is a perfect segue to talk about the other aspects of expedition. And I like the fact that you jump from the salmon to the Indian context, which is what my next question was going to be. So you just tell us about this one particular project. How did you put different elements like service learning, and how did you integrate different disciplines, character building skills, everything that EL stands for, or a really good EL expedition brings about? Can you just walk us through the different aspects? And it could be a long answer, but yeah, there are a lot of us who are raring to create our own expedition or modify something which has been given to us. So I think we'll really love to know your experience of creating an expedition at the Heritage School in the Indian context.
Okay, so I think, so I talked a little bit about sort of the launch and the broad structure, and I do think you have some important work there. The EL literacy curriculum, I think it's important to remember the EL literacy curriculum, which I think you do use elements of, but is not the whole package, right? So so I think of it as you have the EL whole school design model. That's all the 37 core practices. And I think it's really good for teachers to engage with that book. It's not that thick. It doesn't really make a great read from cover to cover, but you can jump around. So you have the core practices, and then you have the EL literacy curriculum. And why I'm doing that distinction is even here at my new school, DPrep here in Bangkok, where we're expanding into the middle grades, I looked again at the EL literacy curriculum. And while it's a fantastic curriculum, I do have a bit of a struggle with it because it is very much based on the American and the US context. And that makes sense when EL is, all of us trying to do this work internationally are doing it under the blessing of Scott and Scott Hartle, the president, and the organization. But as you know, their focus is still on the United States. So they didn't develop this curriculum with the international context in mind. And why I say that is some of the topics within there fit this model for US students in the US context, but not so much in the international. So I think it's important for the school to look at the structure of what's really going well in the literacy curriculum or the core practices, but to map those best practices to our own context in terms of figuring out, well, what are the topics for us, right? So in the case of, it's somewhat lost when I speak to colleagues in the West alone, but how radical it was to take students from a school like Heritage in Gurgaon, which serves a relatively privileged sector. And that's fine. I mean, that's not an ethical judgment, just in terms of the socioeconomics of the community. That's a privileged community. They tend to be wealthier and higher status. So just by having those students spend time with a cobbler who works sitting at the side of the road every day and is actually a caste from Rajasthan, and to give him the same attention in terms of hearing his story, understanding it through the lens of the hero's journey, which was actually part of the learning expedition. So they were doing the hero's journey. So I should try to point some of that out. So in English language arts, now we're starting to get into it. Well, how do you do topics? So they did comparative mythology and the hero's journey in their English language arts class, which mapped to the Cambridge Lower Secondary Standards, right? But the reason we did it is in terms of unpacking the common human story, right? That's one of the things we were getting at, is having one group do a cobbler and another group do a corporate lawyer, right? In this particular audience, I don't need to explain why that's a fairly radical juxtaposition. And having them look for the same elements. What were the challenges? So they found out both had strengths and both had challenges. Both had moments like the hero's journey. Another element of the hero's journey is the journey to the underworld, right? Which represents the struggle, the dark, hard times which, if you think about it, most human lives have, right? We have a period of great turmoil and struggle, where we question our values and what are we doing with our lives, right? So to find that whether it was a cobbler or a corporate lawyer, you could find these sort of same elements that mapped to the hero's journey that we learned in English language arts. So that's where we're getting into it. Now you also have a ton of research and writing. So journalistic writing, we actually worked with PARI. We had them come in as experts. I feel like I'm bouncing around here a little bit because there's so many facets to this, but so another critical thing is find your partner organization and your experts. I am relentless, almost, in terms of anytime I meet somebody and I go, wow, that's interesting. Like the other day, I just met on vacation, a guy who here in Bangkok, and I said, what do you do? And he says, oh, I do solar panels design, they sell. And I said, aha, I got to have your card, right? I don't know how, but I know someday we'll be doing something on sustainable and green energy. And so I collect cards, I collect contacts. It's a little bit different, a ways from you, but the Jaipur Literature Festival, anyone can go to that. That is an absolute gold mine for EL educators. Not only to get inspired and excited yourself, but I've only been able to go twice, but each time came away with at least 15 cards and waited in those long lines after the Jaipur Literature Festival talks, not to get my book signed, but to get the person's card and say, hey, if I'm ever doing something with students, would you be an expert? That's how I met Pari, actually. I heard the founder of the People's Archive of Rural India gave a speech and waited in line, spoke to him afterwards, and he said, I don't have time, but go talk to this woman, who ended up, for basically at cost, we flew her to Gurgaon, and they were the launch. They actually presented to students and were part of the hook. They came back and met with the students in small groups. And so you had professionalist journalists. These women are published and work all over India. They sat with our 7th graders and read their interviews and articles and gave them feedback. Our teachers were perfectly capable of doing that work themselves. But the power of having professional journalists where the kids could go online and see their articles, sit with them and give them, warm and cool feedback. Some positive, but also say, this isn't compelling. You didn't get the heart of the story. I don't think it's really gelling. You need to work on this, right? So now we're getting into, I guess, when we look at core practices and the structures of a learning expedition, we break them out. But in truth, they're all happening simultaneously interwoven, because that's equally character, right? We want our students to be able to stand up when it's time to run for a government office, or if they need to pitch their ideas to a venture capitalist when they're starting up a company, or when they're sitting for their first job interview or college interview, right? So that self-confidence, that self-awareness, that self-management can come from 7th grade, knowing that you've got to present to a pair of real journalists and go over your work, and then sit with them and have a meeting with them while they give you feedback and coach you on your next steps. So in terms of character development, that's happening just alongside the actual work of getting good writing and your English language arts concepts in there. So the English language arts, often, as I'm sure you know, a learning expedition often has a weight to be a little bit more humanities weighted or a little bit more math science weighted. That's fine. So don't be afraid to be creative in trying to map those other learning objectives to it. So what does science have to do with this? Well, we found a way, because the product that they made, and we were cut short of the final element of the publishing of this due to COVID, because we were literally 2 days away from the day when we were supposed to have a gallery opening of the work for this learning expedition. When the lockdown happened, when the first lockdown happened last March, 2 Marches ago. But what about math and science? Well, part of the idea of putting all these people through the same lens, whether it was the corporate lawyer or the cobbler, was we had the students did a formal, quote unquote, black and white portrait photograph of each of them. And we did black and white on a black background because it was very leveling. So when you look at this book, you just see face, face, face. And so the idea was to focus in on the human face, not all the other clues of gender, socioeconomic status, occupation, caste, clan, regionality, all the layers of things that bring up our identity, but was to really, focus on this sort of shared humanity of all the people. All right, so what does this have to do with science? Well, we're using cameras. How does a camera work? How do you light a subject appropriately to take a really good photograph? And in our case, we realized we could not bring these people to the school for a constellation of reasons. So we had to make a portable photography studio and photograph people, which means we had to light them with natural light using reflectors. Well, light and sound. So there's my science unit. Now, so I always, you've got to really be able to be comfortable. I know I just drifted way up into the clouds about identity and the hero's journey and the human story, but we were still able to bring that down to a middle school curriculum unit on light and sound. That's very classic. It's right there in Cambridge Lower Secondary. And if sometimes you walked into the classroom and you saw students doing basic experiments with prisms around light, you would think there's nothing special happening here. This looks like any classroom of middle school kids learning about light and sound. The difference is, again, that emotional investment, a reason to care. Why they needed to understand about light was so that they would know how to use the reflectors to take really powerful portraits of their people. So we had that deep investment, and they did. So they went out in the field and they were using the reflectors. They had to be able to understand how light travels in the wave, directionality, shadow, a little bit about how a digital camera worked. We had another fantastic collaborator on that one in terms of the Museo camera, or it turns out one of the largest. Sometimes you get lucky. I'm sure there's so many resources in Mumbai that are similar, but it turns out the largest camera museum in Asia is in Gurgaon. Who knew? Very, very famous, accomplished Indian photographer took his fortunes and opened up a camera museum, and he was thrilled to work with us. So we went to the camera museum. The kids did cyanotype prints. They went into a dark room. They learned about how a camera works, an analog versus digital, all that stuff. So there's the bit on light and sound. This being Cambridge Lower Secondary, they also had global perspective class. So issues of economics, migration, all the different topics. If anybody, I don't know if you're doing, okay, so any of your global perspective teachers, your brain should be abuzz with this. I mean, there's so many topics you can do about immigration versus migration, how economies work, issues of social justice, status of marginalized groups, of gender identity. I mean, global perspective was the key to global perspectives was to decide what not to do, so you didn't overwhelm the curriculum and the kids with trying to shove 3 years worth of experiences into 3 or 4 months. So in the mapping of this, again, I often work from, what started this with me was I did see a work, there's an exemplar of work of the immigrant's journey in the US that was done by a school in the US. I'd seen that product, which gave me an idea from the US context. And then I was sitting at JLF, and when Pari, I just went in there because it looked interesting, and that's when the lightning bolt hit me. So I often reverse engineer from the compelling topic. So I knew that if I combined what Pari does in spirit with the kinds of format, the structural format of what I'd seen in the US context, and reimagine it in the Indian context, we were going to have that compelling topic. And we were going to have that emotions awoken in the students. We were going to have the call. It may seem backwards, and sometimes it's good to start with the standards, but I said, I know I'll find the standards. I can find everything of consequence. Takes a lot of broad skills. You always have to be literate. You always have to collaborate. You always have to think and problem solve. The standards can be found. So that's actually, I start with that, and then I go and map the standards. And of course, with my team of teachers, it's not coming from me. So then I say, can I get other people equally as excited? And they bring in new directions and elements. So it's not like I write it and then say to the teachers, here, you do this. I kind of see Stephen Levy once called it as the grandpa role, right? Where you come in and you get all excited, you get the grandkids all riled up, and then you then step back and let them do their thing. So that's part of my role as a coach is, and I'm there to coach them, but I also leave parts undone so that if I can get the group of us riled up and excited about this, and then, you know, step back and let them do their work and figure out how they want to take their pieces of the pie. So particularly at the middle school level, I think I talk a lot or think a lot about chunking. I just got to alert my battery's low. I'm going to make sure my charger's working. Don't be afraid to chunk it, right? So we have this big project and we have all these elements. Chunk it down to a unit on light and sound. Chunk it down to an English language arts unit on the hero's journey. And then another unit on journalistic writing. In global perspective, chunk it down onto migration and its effect on economies. And then it becomes, accessible in smaller units when you look at this whole thing. So you keep that common thread that you're building and building and building to, but you have these different subcomponents, and then individual teachers or smaller teams can do that. So I've talked about the experts, field work. We had a lot of field work. Obviously, they were going out into these communities, multiple visits. We had 2 collaborating partners between PARI and the Camera Museum. And then, the authentic audience part. So the idea that they were very motivated, they would actually create a book. On the portrait pages, there was a QR code that went to a website. And the part we didn't get to do is they were going to install these portraits around Gurgaon. So you'd have the portraits of the people with no explanation and the QR code. So you just have like 12, 13 big portraits, and people would be like, who are these people? Are they special? Are they not? Like, why? And like, particularly in the Indian context, people would say, well, that woman, she looks like she might be Banjara. And that woman's wearing a suit. Why are they all? And so the idea would, they would be intrigued and they would get their smartphone out, they'd click on the QR codes, and that would take them to web pages that the students had built with the background and the story of each of these individuals and get them engaged. COVID, we were never allowed to do that, but I want to highlight that element of action or service and publishing their work to an authentic audience is also a critical component of sort of landing the plane and bringing it all home.
The project I think you're talking about is community face project, right?
Excuse me? I'm frozen for a minute. I'm not getting
the that you're talking about, which is it something or maybe I need to switch places. Can you hear me now, Chris?
Yes, you're back. It could be on my end too. You just froze for a minute.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, they're saying I think Bhavesh's video is freezing. So let's try it for a minute, or I'll just switch places. I'm saying the project that you drew inspiration was the Community Faces project, right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Right,
so it's one I would highlight for your middle school. I think would be very replicable in your context in Mumbai.
Exactly, especially in Bhiwandi with so many people migrating from other states to Bhiwandi and using it as a makeshift arrangement before they shift to other suburbs in Mumbai. So I think, community faces or something like that would be replicable in a place like Bhiwandi for sure, with so many migrant people coming in. Yeah. What was the guiding question and how long was the expedition? How many teachers were involved? How much of? Let me.
I think you froze again, but I don't know. Can other people? Yeah, you're back. So we had. It was hard to say what that there was.
Give me one. Just give me 1 minute. Sorry, give me 1 minute. Is this better?
I think so.
Okay, let's try this. Yeah. So yeah, I was just wondering, what was the guiding question? How long was the project? How many teachers were involved? How much of the curriculum could you actually map it onto this expedition? And what happened to the other pieces of the curriculum which did not get mapped? Did you teach them through a regular classroom lecture, or yeah, just walk us through that?
So, how many teachers? We've included many teachers.
Chris, I think we've lost you. I think I have some chat, some people telling me that your voice isn't coming through. So maybe there's some issue from your side also.
Let me try to rejoin.
Okay. Guys, this session is likely to get extended. Are you okay with that? So I think the way we are going, we haven't even come to your question. So yeah, we'll extend beyond the regular time, 1 o'clock. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, you're back.
Sorry about that delay. I tried restarting a few things to see if this helps.
Okay, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Good. So I would say that thinking about particularly at the middle school level. Now this looks different in primary, of course, but thinking at the middle school level, I'd come back to the idea of chunking when you think about teachers. So when math was there, math was mostly, this particular learning expedition that I happened to start with, we ended up calling Who is Gurgao? So if you ask what was the guiding question, that was the expedition title was sort of the guiding question. And I know that doesn't really make sense, right? Gurgao is a place. So how do you say who is Gurgao? But that was sort of the provocativeness of it is Gurgao a place or is it a people? And as a people, as I'm sure many of you know of Gurgao, it was a small sleepy village from what I was told until quite recently. In the past 15, 20 years, just exploded. So it's had this tremendous influx. So is Gurgao the original community with its roots in Haryana? Is Gurgao the cyber tech hub of a suburb of Delhi that it's starting to become? Is Gurgao all the workers that have come in to build the place and to be labor in all its institutions from as far away as Bengal or Nepal? All these, who is it? Who gets to claim this city's identity? So I think that was sort of the original. There were many sub questions that sort of fit underneath that, but that would have been sort of the initial broad overarching question. And then unpacking that was to look at all these case studies of individuals to say, it's no one group of people, right? It's this incredible diversity of lives and stories that that make up, who the community is. So within that, getting back to the individual teacher, so it took a long time too. This was a particularly long one. We worked on it from September through March, but it had all these different elements. I'm gonna get somebody to take this. Excuse me for 1 second. Amy? Sorry, the joys of
challenges for doing it online.
So back to this. So the chunking of it, in this months-long process, global perspective was clearly a long driver, along with the English language arts. But they would often pass elements off back and forth. So while English language arts was doing this deep dive into the hero's journey, math was just covering their regular math curriculum, right? But they knew this was coming. The connection came when it comes to data analysis and graphing. So later in the project, as when we get into that, through Global Perspective, the Global Perspective teacher, with the help of the experts of PARI, PARI being the acronym for People's Archive of Rural India, focused them to go look at statistics on migration. And to look at even metrics like the number of bus routes in and out of Gurgao over time, right? So there was interesting data. You can track the explosion, but you can also track who people are and where they're coming from by these increase in these bus routes as more and more migrants were coming in to work in the city from different areas. So that was an opportunity then to connect with mass and do the work around graphing and data analysis, right? So math had, an intensive period.
I think we've lost him again. Sanam, we'll need Rohan to edit this video before we can put it up on Facebook and other social media. we'll have to cut some part in the middle.
Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
I'm not stopping or pausing the recording in between because there is this voice that pops up. This video is being recorded and paused.
Okay.
That's the reason. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's fine. He can edit.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you have any follow-up questions, so what I've tried to do, everybody, what I've tried to do is rather than talk widely about different things, I've tried to zone in on just the zoom in just the expedition part. So we get the nuts and bolts of it, and particularly in Indian context. So in the light of it, if you have any additional questions or you just want to ask different sets of questions than the ones that you asked, probably you could just put it in the chat box. But yeah, it'll be nice to hear of how he's been able to pull off an expedition in the Indian context and what have been the learnings and the nitty-gritty of that. Or you could go back to the document, the Word document that we've created, questions for Chris, and you could maybe just make changes there. So it'll be actually easier for me to read from that list. Hi, Chris.
I'm so sorry. I think my internet went out, but I restarted it. I'm back. So yeah, we're talking about time, and again, I guess I'll try to close this and not get bogged down in it, but mapping out the flow for the different teachers so that they understand their role and how they're going to connect with each other. So for example, in the write-ups of the global perspective teacher took the lead on preparing the questions for the interviews and supporting the interviews, okay? So they got that ready, but the actual writing piece was handed off to the English language arts teacher so that they could teach the grammar, the conventions of journalistic writing, all the other elements of speech. So those teachers, they didn't have a lot of opportunity because of our structure and our schedule and the challenges to sit in the same classroom and co-teach, but mapping out the workflow so the students are at the center of it, but they're passing the work off from one teacher to the other. Same thing, so on the website that for some of them that went with each of their individual write-ups, the science teacher had them represent some of their work in science on understanding how a camera works and how they took the pictures and doing the background. So the science teacher could take care of that component within their class, but it went into the website. And of course, the ICT teacher, we took the lead on crafting the website, but the content was generated by the students in these other classrooms. So I would say, after getting excited about the idea, mapping out the compelling topic, figuring out who our partner organizations are going to be, the next step was to map the learning objectives. So going right back, not the scheme of works, not the suggested units, but I think it's really important if you're using Cambridge, you have to go right to the learning objectives. And it was really tedious, but what we ended up doing is we put them all in a spreadsheet. So we had them digitally. So we had to copy, but that way we could, because they're chunked together by however Cambridge thought of them in terms of independent strands. But that allowed teachers to move them around. And don't be afraid to change years. If it's an 8th grade learning objective, but it fits with a 7th grade learning objective, move it. I'm a strong believer that does not matter in the long run. So, we sort of map it, and then you develop your shared team calendar in terms of developing the timeline. Okay, what's this flow going to look like? So when we think about our units, we think about again, I'm talking here really through the middle school lens. So my apology to the elementary teachers, although I think some of this still applies. It's just more on the homeroom model. But we talk about units that are mapped to the learning expedition or standalone units. So after you've kind of done this for your year, you have your 2 learning expeditions and you figured out the compelling topics, figured out your learning objectives that you can map to it, you group them into your expedition related units that different teachers are going to take in different scopes and sequence. That kind of blocks out your year. And then you look at the gaps. What learning objectives did not fit into a learning expedition? How can we group those together into the standalone units that then fill up for the rest of the year? So even though science was mapped to this learning expedition, they didn't just do light and sound from September to March, right? So she had lots of other mini units or other units that happened that weren't necessarily connected to the learning expedition. And that's fine. And I think this was part of your question too. So the phrase that I've been using a lot is this idea of active pedagogy. And just because you're not in a learning expedition doesn't mean you throw out all those other elements, right? So even your standalone unit, so let's take this from the science teacher's perspective. Their standalone units that aren't connected to the learning expedition, they can still make those experiential. They can still have field work. They can still have service, right? They may not have all the full-blown elements of a learning expedition, but we don't switch that stuff off just because it's not in a learning expedition. So maybe just the expert part. Maybe you're doing something on, chemistry, and you're bringing in somebody who works at a water quality plant to talk with the kids, and you're going to go have them take a tour of the plant. That's fine. Again, it might not have the big launch and the call and the service and the product and the publishing, but you should still integrate all those powerful elements into your curriculum, whether they're learning expedition related or not.
And I think I'll get in touch with you separately to get even more details in it. And especially I'm interested in knowing that since we're using the EL curriculum and some parts of the EL Flex curriculum, how does that tie with the expeditions? Because the curriculum enables us to do a lot of things which we otherwise did not know. It also inhibits us in parts. How to strike that balance of doing a full-fledged expedition which is divorced from the curriculum, or use the curriculum as a base of creating an expedition. I just want to make sure before we talk about it, or whenever we talk about it, to get to the teacher's questions. So the one question that I have here is from Hemant. Hemant, do you want to switch on your camera and ask directly to Chris?
Yeah, so Chris, the question I had was this, how long did it take for you to design this expedition, what you just talked about, what is Gurgaon? Because that thing constantly, puts pressure on us. Whenever we think of creating our own expedition, we feel like, okay, do we have the skills in our team to design our own expedition? How long will it take? How will we map all the standards? So just want to know, what goes behind the scenes before you even, start with an expedition.
Right. So it's both a nice opportunity to explore the one I'm sharing, who is Gurgaon, but it's also, I want to acknowledge, this was one of the most complicated learning expeditions I've ever done. So it shouldn't, I hope it inspires people, but admittedly, it's on the upper end in terms of complexity and time and investment. So I would say, So I went to the Jaipur Literature Festival in January, and I just sort of cooked on it myself for a while, thinking about how it might look. We really started working on it, I think as much as possible in something like this, having time with your staff at the end of the school year before the start of the next year is good. So we really mapped out the components of the learning expedition in what we call our Summer Institute, which happens actually at days at the end of the school year. So that would have been in May and June, right? So we were talking about it as we were wrapping up the year. And we did have 4 or 5 days. We didn't get to spend them just on this, but where we had regular meetings with the full team to brainstorm and to create a common template in a Google Drive and to start collecting links and resources. Why that was important is that going into the summer, teachers kind of knew their partner, because again, the whole thing can be a little overwhelming. So they had time to think over the summer what their components were. And then admittedly, there was an element of building the airplane while flying, right, that happens, so that we're still designing it and figuring it out as it's evolving over the months, so it becomes part of our plan. So this one will, take a little time. But I do encourage. They do take such an investment that trying to find. I'm in this process right now in this new school here in Thailand, but trying to decide, okay, this is going to be a major 7th grade learning expedition. And give yourself permission, just like you would the kids, to have success and failure, right? The first year, everything's not gonna go right, and it's gonna be a struggle, and things are gonna take too long. And but if you feel like you've got good curriculum going, this might become the thing that you do in 7th grade, it's worth it. But I think so often they take 2 or 3 years to really ripen and mature.
And Chris, so along with you, did you have you mentioned that there are other teachers also who were helping you with designing the expedition. So I just want to know, like, these teachers, they were the one who would be teaching those subjects, or you had a separate team of curriculum designers who were working with you on the expedition?
No, these are the teachers teaching the. This is a key part of an EL school, I think. I'll be honest here. I'll pull back the curtain a little bit for those of us in administration and the hiring. Not every teacher is ready for what EL is asking them to do, and I've had to learn this. So I ask in my interviews now, like, I lay it out for them. I say, imagine Google in its startup phases, right, or something like that. Like, are you ready for those long hours of struggling with questions and combing through learning objectives and designing? There are many teachers who have great careers where they just show up and Cambridge gives them a scheme of work, and here's the layout of the units, and here's the textbook. And I don't want to, overly judge that, but I think it's, to me, it's critical that all teachers see themselves as curriculum creators and designers. And so they need to be a part of that work. Now, it's great if you have a coach or sort of a hub of the wheel. That's the metaphor, or at least for what I aspire to in everything I do. I'm not on the top of the pyramid. I'm not here. I'm the hub of the wheel. It's my job to try to synchronize so many moving parts. But it's the teachers, right? If they're on the spokes of the wheel, they're where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. They're the ones where it's so critical that they have a say in designing and crafting the learning expedition.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks.
Maitri, do you want to come in with your question?
Hi, Chris. So I had got your expedition, and I have been listening to what you're saying about how it needs to have an emotional connect with the students, and that. So this was my original question, which said that I think. Yeah. Sorry, I'll just keep my video off. My internet is unstable. My original question was that, what is the criteria for choosing a topic for an authentic expedition? You might come across a lot of ideas. How do you decide upon that? Okay, this is something that we can build around. And
that's a great.
Yeah, I think the second question was already got answered.
All right. So how do we decide? So, I'm a little impish on this. I think the excitement factor is key. So first of all, am I excited? Do I get, I can, talk about the memory from emotional engagement. When I was sitting at the Jaipur Literature Festival, listening to the Pari people speak of their work, I got all excited. I mean, it was these stories they had, thinking about the insight. So the founder of PARI, if I have it right, he was a professional journalist, well accomplished in India in the media. And he just had an epiphany one day when he worked out the math to say 60% of rural India lives, 60% of the Indian population lives in a rural context, and they're making up less than 1% of our stories. It's like, there's a massive blind spot. It was such a compelling, and so he created this organization, and their work was so beautiful. So I got excited. So I would say, my excited, right? Then the second step is to then say, well, can I see the children getting excited, right? Because there are many things that excite me that may not excite 8-year-olds or 12-year-olds, I'm sure. So, in my thinking on this test was, because I was going to target this for 7th grade, adolescents are naturally drawn to issues of identity because they don't know who they are, or they're different things, one day to the next. They also tend to be drawn to social justice issues because it fits very much, they're living it every day. The tribal warfares that happen in the adolescent, right? Who's in, who's out, our identities as males and females are taking on new ramifications they never had before. There's so many issues swirling there. So I said, I think this will speak to the issues of adolescence because these are things that are fundamental to their own experience. And it panned out, like the example of these 2 young women who were starting as, 7th grade young ladies to grapple with what that meant for them, their femaleness in the Indian context, about opportunity and challenges and their own safety, to connect with this other woman and what the conversations they've been having with their moms and their aunts, and that spoke something so powerful to them. So that worked. So then I really think about, can kids get that? In there also is the rest of my team going to get excited about it? All right. The next thing I would say is very early on for me is this idea of experts, partners, and field work. Is there something doable there? Because you might have a great topic, but if it involves needing to go to a International Space Station launch pad, that probably isn't going to be doable unless you're very lucky to live next to me. So again, this passed the test. All I needed was Gurgaon. Gurgaon, because of its incredible diversity, was a very rich area. I had PARI on board, and then I stumbled. Literally, we Googled and said, we had no idea that the Asia's largest camera museum was 20 minutes from our school. So that kind of sealed the deal. So now I'm excited, compelling topic. I've got field work. I've got partner organizations. The next test I go right to, before I would do any other planning, is look at your standards, look at your learning objectives. Can I start to map? And I don't think you have to do this in detail yet, but can I map my content and skills, my learning objectives? Character, it's always there. High quality work, you'll find a product, right? So I'm going back now. I don't know how much you talk about the 3 dimensions of student achievement. It's in the core practices book. Because I'm at a new school.
We do, yeah.
Okay, so I think about that a lot. If we're talking about our goal, that's our outcome. All 3 dimensions in balance. So character and high quality work, for me, that's easy. There are all kinds of ways I can get at that, but master knowledge and skills, you got to look at your learning objectives and say, where can I map? If it's falling on either, that marriage between the compelling topic and the standards is one of the most critical variables, and it can fail from either side. You could have a great partner and an exciting topic, but it's just not fitting with your learning objectives. Or you could have really some exciting units for learning objectives, but you're going to have to launch them with, good morning, boys and girls. Today we're going to learn about amphibians, right? Don't you want to learn about amphibians? No, I'm in 3rd grade. I don't care about amphibians, teachers making me learn. So you may have a great content, but those other elements are missing, right? So the sweet spot you're looking for is when that compelling topic and the standards, when they're coming together. Then you go, I've got a particular planning template. I don't know if I've shared it with you before, but it actually maps these things out in sequence, because I think that is really critical. Is it starts with a compelling topic and everything I just described, but that next step is go right to your standards and you start to chunk them in baskets, map them to the unit. If you've got there, I think everything else is going to flow. You'll figure out your product, you'll figure out your audience, you'll work on all those other elements, you'll map your character targets. Is that answering your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
And for those of you who are going to read the Salmon article or get expired about who is Gurgao, really map it to the distilled elements. Don't get distracted by the salmon part or the photography and the faces part. I mean, that's sure, hopefully you'll find some inspiration there, but it's not about animals or interviewing people as journalists. Again, the deep structure, keep coming back to the deep structure. Emotional engagement, call to do the work, connection with real professionals outside of school that you can interact with, authentic audience, service, product, right? These, when I went going all the way back to, I know I've said a lot, but all the way back to the beginning of my topic, this is the distillation from those thousands of educators and hundreds of schools that EL captured, right? Because it can be formalized a bit. It is replicable. So those are the key elements to look for in planning that you can find in your own context. What for Polymath are going to be those big rocks you're going to stand on for your learning expeditions at your own school.
Chris, we lost you there for about 30 seconds.
Sorry.
I think we lost you again.
No, I'm able to hear him. I was able to hear him.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
then it's something on my side. Okay, all right. Okay, got it.
So like I know you.
Okay, great. Nishita, do you want to come in? Sorry, Chris, go ahead. Yeah.
So like you built a frog pond, right? At the school? Did you do that?
Yeah, Chris, yeah. We built that frog.
And that was mapped to the EL English Language Arts curriculum, right? Because they have a section on amphibians and frogs.
Right, right.
So I think that's fantastic. And from the story I've heard of that, it worked really well. But I think in the evolution of an EL school, and I'm pretty convinced you're at that stage, is to look at that and say, okay, not about the EL curriculum or frogs in the pond. What is the deep structure? And then start to build your own learning expeditions, like replicating and mirroring that deep structure. And you'll start to be able to move to have your own body of work. That is just, it will even be more powerful in the end.
Yeah, I seem to be having some internet issues on my side. So maybe Hemant or Sanam, one of you guys could come in. I want to make sure I get all the questions. But yeah, Nishita, do you want to come in? And after Nishita, we have Charmi.
Hi, Chris. So the question that I had was, because of the pandemic, we've all moved online. So, and the modules are almost like default to a physical classroom. And now we have the flex curriculum. But when we've moved online, how do we keep the essence of EL going into the classrooms or into interactions while we still continue over Zoom calls and online classrooms?
I was hoping you would tell me. It's very hard. I think we're all struggling with it. So again, I would start with give yourself permission to struggle, right? I don't think anybody feels like they've got this dialed in. So yeah, it's hard, and give yourself permission to struggle. One of the things is, I would say, is as much as you can, just in general with the online and the virtual, is realize how much you may have to change some of the fundamental building blocks of what we think of as school, right? So in my own experience working with schools, both in heritage in India and even here in Thailand, you know, when you have to go into virtual school, your first instinct is to take your schedule and move it online. So what were your class periods become Zoom call sessions, right? But one of the things that we found is that doesn't work. That's not the best way. So, and you know, I mean, I remember one of the ways that struck me is I saw teachers having class, and at the end of the class they said, okay, here's your homework. child's at home all day, sitting at the same desk. So even the concept of classwork versus homework, that vocabulary was nuts. So what are they really saying? Oh, here was our group time where we were all together. Now you have some independent work to do at your own time. So what we did is we started thinking about how you can restructure time into these. We talked about it in terms of whole group synchronous, small group work, which can be synchronous or asynchronous. Are these terms you use in your vocabulary, the synchronous versus asynchronous? So I imagine you talked about it. And then individual work. And so that giving yourself permission to break up the activities in a new way around when do I want all my students together with me live on a call? When can I, or maybe it's better if, let's say, to split the class into 4 sections, and I'm going to meet with a small group, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm going to give it, or 2 sections, 4 is a lot, 2 or 3. Do I have a TA who can help? Or even though it's less face time with me, we all know how little sometimes we accomplish meaningful, one teacher, the entire class on a Zoom call. So maybe it's more effective to meet with a small group and have the others doing an asynchronous task, either individually or in a small group. With your older kids, we even had some success setting up small group work. And the teachers at first panicked, said, how can I have 4 students meeting without a teacher there? They're gonna goof off. Yeah, they might goof off for a little bit, but if you hold them accountable for showing their work, and eventually they're gonna get bored of goofing off, and a lot of them started to produce stuff. So I think trying to break free and realize our model of the schedule is based on taking all the kids to a building, bringing them home every day. But now that we're in the virtual realm, what are some other ways that I can break up and use time? I can vary the way I'm working between whole group, synchronous, small group, synchronous and asynchronous, and individual time.
Thank you.
Charmy?
Hi, Chris.
Hello.
Okay, so I would like to know what might help schools to get continuous support from parents and teachers with such high demands of structure of education at the school that you're currently working with.
So how do we get parents support? How do we get them on board? I believe, so there's a running joke that our parents, that I take as a compliment, which is we have regular coffee hours and parent meetings, right, where they come in and their joke to me said, Chris, when do we get our our graduate school credit hours or our degree in education, right? Because we let them in on what we're doing, right? So we actively educate our parents on the difference between standards, curriculum, and pedagogy, right? Those are 3 different things. You have standard frameworks, you have the taught or written curriculum, and then you have your pedagogy, how you implement them. So to really meaningfully talk to parents about what we're doing with their kids every day, we need to understand them, otherwise they get confused. They say, well, where is the IB curriculum? There's no such thing. Oh, the teachers create it. There is such thing. But they say, how come you have Common Core standards, but you're following IB, but you're EL? I can say, well, I need to have a meaningful conversation. So the overarching theme is bring them in. You have to repackage it in a way that's accessible, but take the time and tell them, this is so important what we're doing. We need you to understand, and we want you to be a part of it. And just like you would with the kids, when you can make that interactive. So I did a workshop on concept-based education that started with a provocation and had the parents designing something where I changed the variable in the systems they were working with. Then I showed them systems and variable science labs, and then we took the concept of system and variables all the way to the high school level. But I started, rather than just talking with them, I at least tried to have an interactive element. But particularly in the Asian context, where there's certain nuances to parents' expectations around education, I talk a lot about rigor. rigor, rigor, rigor. And I'm not going at it directly, but I'm being a little provocative because I'm working under the assumption that many of them have misunderstood. They've equated rigor with marks and exam scores. So what I'm trying to do all the time is, with a little bit of wordplay, is to re-educate them. That doesn't sound too Orwellian, about what rigor really means. But I use that word a lot, and I use it, one of the ways I use it a lot is with the 3 dimensions of student achievement. So in my tagline, the way we use that graphic in our community is, we talk about the 3 dimensions of student achievement is at the top of my slide, and right under it says a expanded and increased vision of rigor in education. All right, and the way I initially unpack the 3 dimensions of student achievement is mastery of skills and knowledge, right? That's everything you already know about in school. That's all the skills kids need and the stuff they need to know. So I say a regular, really good CBSE school, or over here in the Thai context, a really good Singapore school, that's what they're doing. And guess what? We do it too. But we do more, because that's all they do. All they're focused on is that mastery of skills and content. So that's one ring, right? So I have a nice visual play to say, see that circle? That's the best CBSE school, that's the best Singapore school, but I have 2 more circles. So my school is also going for character, equally important, equally intentionally, and is also going for high quality work, which we do have to spend a little time on that, because they'll think that means top marks in an exam. And as you know, that's talking about the complex tasks, that's talking about authentic products. But that's sort of my initial entry point, is saying a regular, even a really good conventional school, it's only giving you 1 dimension. And we're going for all 3. So by definition, we're giving you more. And I map that back to rigor. This is more rigorous because I am going to be just as rigorous with your child about mastery of skills and knowledge, but I'm also going to be rigorous about character and high quality work. So that's, I think that's important, because I think there is, to be honest, a lot of parents, even they buy into our schools because they send their kids, right? They're still looking at their friends, sending their kids and how many textbooks they have in their backpack, and they're getting rankings of where they are in the class, right? So, and even where we have exams, like if you're going to administer the Cambridge exams, or in our schools we have other, exams, I want them to know, like, that's only down here. Our assessments are up here, right? So that's looking at it one lens of mastery of knowledge and skills. But again, we're doing so much more. So it's more rigorous. And the other one I use a lot is, so I give an example within that of, we have different graphics of what I can share the slides with you, but I have one that I use a lot in our open houses that says, same standards, same curriculum, but different pedagogy. So it's a picture of students sitting at their desks with textbooks taking in a science class, and a group of our students in a national park meeting with a ecologist using iPads to document energy flow through ecosystems. And this has an expanded vision of rigorous education. And I say both of these groups of kids are learning about science. Both of them have access to text and curriculum. But this group of kids sitting at their desks, they're stopping at memorizing science information. But my kids in the national park, they had to go beyond that and work as scientists, right? And that's why it's more rigorous. The conventional school will stop here at the memorization and the content knowledge. But an EL school is going to go into that application and ask our students to work as mini professionals. And that, again, to try to re-educate, remap them so they start thinking that's what rigor looks like. And I'll say to them, when was the last time in your profession that you took a test? When was the last time you communicated by handwriting an essay in 5 paragraphs and handed it to them? None of you have, because that's not how you use skills and knowledge outside of the context of school. So what we're doing, right, what you're fighting against is experiential learning means play. It means dumbing it down and making learning fun. If my child's enjoying school, that means rigor has been decreased. And so all these different ways I'm going at it, I'm trying to say, don't mistake enjoying learning and engagement for playing or dialing it down. This is in fact more rigorous. When I take your kid to the national park, it's not because I'm trying to take away the content. I'm actually making them apply it as a scientist. And that is how you use your skills, right? If you're an architect, you don't take math tests. You meet with clients, you have to write, you have to design, you have to deal with budgets. Look, I am doing all those complex tasks in my high quality work to mention student achievement, just like you do. These conventional schools, they're not doing it. I am more rigorous because I'm going deep. It's really important work. And I know I probably gave you a longer answer than you needed, but I think it's critical that we do this work, because if we're gonna, in 20 years, I hope we have 50 EL schools scattered throughout Asia. And in order for us to do that, we do have some branding to do. We do have some work to do to get our communities to understand this is really the future of education. Great.
Thank you. This is gonna help me a lot with my work in school. Thank you so much. Bhavesh, can I move on with the next question?
Actually, I think we are out of time. So maybe we should wrap up. If everyone can turn on their videos, so Chris gets to see our wonderful team.
And I can follow up. You have my email. I'm happy to connect with people if there's additional follow-up. Again, I've talked a lot all over the place. We're talking about one of my favorite subjects, so forgive me, but hopefully you found something in there you could relate to, or you felt was inspiring or connected to your work.
And Chris, I just had one last question before we close this. Since we are following the EL curriculum and we spoke almost exclusively about expeditions, like how do you marry the two, or are they mutually exclusive, or is there a point they can meet in the middle?
I think you can try to meet in the middle. I mean, you can tell because I spent so much time on expeditions. I spent a lot of time. So in the United States right now, what's happening is there is a shift. So you have what you would call schools doing the full design model, or schools that really all they know and do about EL is the EL literacy curriculum. So I think you can marry the two, but I'll be honest, my opinion is I predict that you will want to evolve over time, and you will start rewriting or remapping elements of that to better fit with your context, the books you want students to read, and your learning expedition. And I think that's fine. You know, the EL literacy curriculum was EL's attempt to make something accessible to big districts. So rather than the school by school by school model with a total transformation of the school with all the 37 core practices, there was something the schools could do. And there's guidance there in how to turn the EL curriculum, literacy curriculum, into learning expeditions and do other active pedagogy, use protocols, use other good instructional practice. My bias is this is my bias, so don't actually listen to me, listen to your instructional leaders at your school. But my proposal is, maybe I should put it that way, make the core practices book the center of your school, in which the EL literacy curriculum is a resource that you draw on to live out the core practices. But I believe from talking to your school leaders and everything that you're saying, you want the full package. You want a full EL school. And for that, you really need to look at that core practices book, and you're going to need to do the work to develop your own curriculum, of which you can use the literacy curriculum as a literacy framework to draw on. But there's a lot more to it. You know, we haven't talked about crew and crew culture. We haven't talked about student engaged assessment, all these other things. So I think that you will have the bandwidth and the long range resource to do that. So when I say put the core practices book in the center, it doesn't mean that you don't get to use the language arts curriculum or that you have to do all the core practices at once. But I think that's the fountainhead where the entire school model will grow from, and that way will allow you to draw on the literacy curriculum where it works and begin to remap or re-author, using it as a model, but re-author elements of it as you develop your own Polymath curriculum.
And I think this is as good a time as ever to do it. We have a brilliant team. People are raring to go. And I go back to initial discussion of that EL is meant for every child. Like every child has an entry point in EL school, but it's not meant for every teacher because you really have to reimagine how teaching looks like and put in long hours, which not every teacher can. But I think with the team that we have, there are more things that we can do, just more than just the EL curriculum. So thank you so much, Chris. And if anyone has any last things to say, to add, to comment, now is the chance to do it.
If I can, am I audible?
Yes.
Chris, wonderful and lecture, really fascinating stuff. I just want to point out three major learnings that I've had, and like my takeaways from the lecture is, and so the high stakes examination environment being like a newer psychological experiment, I never looked at it that way. I thought, when I came into this world, that was the norm. So to look at it from like zooming out and looking at it as a fairly recent experiment was something that really blew my mind, and then makes me like invest more into something as new as EL. So that was something that I took away. The other thing was, again, heightened emotions allow for greater learning. I think that's a great insight, because when I was just running through all the memorable like memories that I've had, and they all involve great like heightened emotions. So then I was able to track back and look at it, and I think that's a great insight. Another thing was us being numb to the natural environment because of lesser interactions, and I think that speaks. Even with the salmon experiment, I can now see why you would get the eggs to the lab, because maybe you're trying for the kids to generate empathy through greater interaction with the salmon, and therefore it's not something that is forced, but it's not something that is prescriptive, that they're living beings like us, so you develop empathy for them, but they're in the process of doing it, they generate so much empathy. So I think all these things were really eye-openers for me. So thank you so much for entertaining and just blowing us with your experience and wisdom. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, it's been fantastic, and this can't be the end of it. We need to have many more such conversations going. As you rightly said, we're just scratching the surface here. So yeah, Chris, thank you for such a great time. Anything you would like to say as a closing comment?
So going back to my initial metaphor of EL being the distillation of wisdom of thousands of teachers and hundreds of schools, don't underestimate the power of you having that exact same phenomenon in your own school. Look for the core practices are not, they're not answers. They're the critical questions to ask. But every school now has to take those core practices and ask those questions and figure them out. Fundamentally different from IB. IB gives you the learner profile and the approaches to learning. EL says you need to have habits of work and habits of character. It doesn't tell you what to put, because it says it's more powerful when you have that conversation and decide as a community, these are our really important character traits that we want to instill, and this is what we think are the habits of work and learning necessary for success. That's more powerful than following a prescription. So moving forward, I would say hold your heads up high and give yourselves that space to be that next group of wise educators who are going to distill for yourself, what are the key things that we need to do? What works in our community? What practices are we going to align throughout our school? And and make sure we do consistently in every classroom? How do we make space for those deeper conversations? Day-to-day stuff will always be there. How do we protect that space so we can do this active distillation and talk about what's working and what's not, and come up with our own framework within the larger EL context? I think it sounds like you're primed to do that. Your leadership is ready to do that. So really, each of you should see yourself as a leader in terms of charting this path forward and your own interpretation of these practices for your school.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you once again. We have, by the way, we have Stephen Levy, Chris, coming in next Saturday. So it's extraordinary that we have you, and then we have Stephen Booth within the space of 7-8 days. So, okay, Chris.
Stephen's far better than I am. So I enjoy your conversation with him, a fabulous human being. He actually served as the master of ceremonies for my marriage to my wife. So he's a dear old friend. So enjoy, Stephen.
Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, bye.